All right, the broadcast has started, Michael.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much, Victoria. And welcome all to today's informational webinar on the Transforming the Youth Justice System Breakthrough Series Collaborative. I'm Michael Lampierre, and I'm the director of the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform at Georgetown University's McCourt School of Public Policy. And on behalf of CJJR and the McCourt School of Public Policy and all of our partners, including the Center for Children's Law and Policy, I want to welcome you to today's session. As you may know, this is the second time we're coming together for an informational webinar to discuss this incredible opportunity. And as we stated in the first webinar, we at CJJR and all of our partners are truly honored and excited to be offering this opportunity to the youth serving field at this moment in time, because it really does focus on a critically important and timely objective, which is the transformation of the youth justice system in this country so that it promotes equity, community, well-being, and positive outcomes for all youth and families who touch the system, including and especially youth and families of color. During today's webinar, our team will provide you with an overview about what this Breakthrough Series Collaborative entails, how it's different from other system reform efforts perhaps that you've been involved in, and how we'll be conducting the application and selection process for those who are selected to be part of this most important endeavor. As we advance to the next slide, as I did in the first webinar, I want to just take a moment to acknowledge that this opportunity could not take place without the generous support of Frank McCourt and his team and our partners at Georgetown University. And we thank all of them for their generosity for making this happen. On the other slide that we were on, we see the agenda for today. As you can see, we've got quite an ambitious agenda, so I'll keep things moving here. After we do some initial introductions, we'll talk a little bit about the goals of the BSC, what the BSC entails, a little bit about the selection criteria and process and timeline, and then we will be entertaining your questions in a designated Q&A period. Please don't be shy with your questions. Submit them in writing using whatever box you see on the screen. I think it's the chat box. It might be the questions and answers box, but whatever you've got in front of you, use it to submit your questions, and we'll do our best to address as many as possible at the conclusion of the webinar. On the next slide, just a few housekeeping items. First, we'll want to make sure that you all have the ability to ask those questions again, so send them in. We do have open office hours on August 3rd at 1 o'clock Eastern for questions as well. So this is a period of time that we are just on the line waiting for folks to join for your questions. And the link can be found on the BSC website, which I believe that you all have. If not, we'll make sure that we submit it to you as a follow-up to this webinar, or perhaps in the chat as well. To get going here, it would be most helpful for us if you could enter your name, organization, city and state, and email address in that chat box or that questions box, whatever you see on your screen. Again, this is very helpful for us to understand who's with us. We've had interest from all around the country so far in this BSC opportunity, and we'd love to know who's with us and who's interested potentially in applying. And then finally, as you digest the information on this webinar, and you may have additional questions in addition to the open office hours on August 3rd, feel free to email Macon Stewart or Victoria Chamberlain from our team directly, and you see their email addresses reflected on the screen here. It's macon.stewart@georgetown.edu and bac54@georgetown.edu as well. This webinar is being recorded. We do plan on sharing the recordings with those of us who were not able to make it. And stay tuned for additional information that we may post on our website in terms of FAQs and other information about the initiative. We hope that you're excited about this opportunity. We appreciate you being here. thanks again. And like I said, we've got a lot to cover. So let me turn it over to my friend and partner, Mark Soler, the Executive Director of the Center for Children's Law and Policy, to facilitate the partner introductions.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mark Soler. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Children's Law and Policy, and I'm here to introduce the project team from the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform at the McCourt School. The team includes Michael Umpierre, who you just saw, Shay Bilchik, who is the founder and Director Emeritus of CJJR, Macon Stewart, who is the Deputy Director of CJJR, Victoria Chamberlain, who is the Program Manager working on this project, Amber Farm, a Senior Research Associate, Sarah Silberman, who is a Program Coordinator, and as consultants and very experienced consultants, Jan Agosti and Lyman Legters, and then as the evaluation team from Georgetown University, Gordon Berlin and Caitlin Chamberlain. From CCLP, the staff working on this are Tiana Davis, our Policy Director for Equity and Justice, who you'll hear from later, Jason Zaney, our Deputy Director, and myself. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Michael Umpierre.
Thanks so much, Mark, for that. And why don't we go ahead and get started with the content for today's webinar. We wanted to kick things off by talking a little bit about the goals of the Breakthrough Series Collaborative. So over the course of the next few minutes, I'll do just that, including highlighting the framework that we'll use that will serve as the roadmap for the work led by the teams that are selected for this opportunity. After I do that, I'll turn it over to Jen Agosti to discuss the ins and outs of the BSC methodology and approach, and why we believe that this is a really powerful vehicle for driving systemic and transformative change all across the country. So with that, on the next slide, please. We'll talk a little bit about the mission. And the mission of this body of work really is to truly transform the youth justice system as it currently exists. We know from data, from research, from our experience, that youth and families of color experience the youth justice system differently than their white counterparts, that they face disparate and harsher treatment, and that the outcomes that we see for youth, families, and communities are simply not what we want them to be, right? We know that racial bias and structural racism continue to plague our justice system, that jurisdictions across the United States have not fully invested in and partnered with communities to really support youth and families. And we've seen far too many jurisdictions view and treat young people and families of color in a deficit-based manner, as opposed to remarkable individuals who have great abilities and strengths. And so we're coming together to say it's time for a change, and we want to work hand in hand with communities to transform our youth justice system in order to improve outcomes for kids, for families, and for communities. And so how exactly we'll do that through the BSC is what we'll explore today. But on your screen, you see 3 core strategies that we intend to examine as part of our work together on the collaborative. The first is the revision of policies and practices that disproportionately and negatively impact youth and families of color. Second, we want to emphasize true investment in and partnership with community to ensure that youth and families can benefit from a full array of needed services and supports. And third, by working to keep youth out of the system altogether, including by expanding the continuum of community-based alternatives to system involvement, we believe that we will shape a fairer, more equitable, and more effective justice system. On the next slide, you'll see that, as I mentioned in this work, we do aim to identify and reduce racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic disparities faced by youth of color in order to improve those outcomes for young people, for families, and for communities. For those communities participating in this effort, this means examining existing disparities in your system, working to understand why they may exist, and then fashioning innovative strategies to address them. Note that this BSC is different than some other efforts that you may have seen, in part because we're looking at socioeconomic disparities as well, recognizing that improving outcomes for young people and families really will take a holistic approach, including exploring those social and economic factors that impact youth and family well-being. Next slide, please. As I said earlier, the BSC is taking an expansive look at the youth justice system, but in partnership with the selected jurisdictions, we're going to focus on 3 areas in particular, and you see them on your screen here: community, system entry, and effective decision-making and case planning. With respect to the first bullet here, we'll be looking at the importance of truly partnering with, empowering, and investing in community. We know that young people do the best in their home communities, supported by family and natural supports, connected to school, connected to pro-social programs and other opportunities that promote their health and well-being. And so this notion of investing in community and partnering with communities at the heart of the BSC. And as you'll hear about this later in the presentation, this commitment really is reflected in the composition of the teams themselves who will participate in this initiative, as we will be requiring each team to include community partners and individuals with lived system experience as part of the effort, including at least one individual representing youth, family, or community to actually co-lead the project on the part of the team. The BSC will focus intentionally on the front end of the system. So when we're talking about entry points into the youth justice system, that's what we mean, including how youth of color are referred or sent to the system in the first place, how they experience diversion or other system alternatives, and how they're treated upon system entry, including at the detention stage. The idea here is that if we can safely reduce the number of young people who enter the system in the first place, we can impact the later stages of system involvement as well. And lastly, for those young people who do enter the system, we'll be examining how to deliver effective decision-making and case planning to ensure that youth and families are offered equitable and effective services that meet their needs and support the goals that they seek to achieve. Next slide, please. At the heart of the BSC is the collaborative change framework, which will serve as a roadmap for all the teams who participate in the initiative. This is a framework that our team at CJJR and CCLP and all of our partners around the table have developed in partnership with a group of more than 45 experts from around the country with lived experience and work experience in the field. And while we don't have the time to delve deeply into each of these 6 components of the framework today, I would like to just cover them briefly so that you can get a sense of what we intend to tackle as part of this BSC and what the teams will be focused on as they strive to achieve the goals of this initiative. The first component you see here of this framework focuses on ensuring that race equity and anti-racism are reflected in all system values, structures, policies, and practice. This includes things like addressing institutional bias and systemic racism head-on, promoting self-awareness and community awareness about the impact of bias and racism, while also promoting cultural responsiveness and shared power in how decisions are made and how youth and families are served. The second component of the framework aims at partnering with youth and families in strength-based ways that reflect shared power. This BSC, as I've mentioned earlier, really is grounded in the notion that young people and families have incredible, unlimited strengths and potential. So how do we harness those strengths? How do we meaningfully engage and partner with youth and families and communities, working hand in hand in order to promote self-advocacy, to promote those positive outcomes for all? The third component supports not just sharing power, but as I mentioned, truly investing in communities so they have the resources and infrastructure to effectively serve youth and families. We want to ensure that youth and families have access to those needed services and that communities really are viewed and respected for their amazing strengths and assets. Next slide, please. The fourth component of our framework here recognizes the need for partnering with other human service systems and communities to enhance how young people are supported, ensuring that community, youth, and family partnership is not just isolated to the justice system, but that we're taking a broad view in terms of how we're working across systems to serve young people and families. We know the reality that young people and families touch multiple systems, not just the justice system, but child welfare, education, behavioral health, and so on. And so it's essential that we're working collaboratively in order to achieve those positive outcomes, to minimize burdens placed on youth and families, to maximize those system resources. Communication, transparency, coordination, they're all part of the puzzle here, and things that our BSC teams will be exploring and taking action on. The fifth component acknowledges that in order to achieve real transformative system change, we need a workforce that is truly equipped and empowered to do their jobs well, really engaging youth and families in effective manners, in humane manners. And so this includes targeted efforts to employ a skilled and anti-racist workforce, including recruiting and retaining a diverse workforce that reflects the community being served. It includes providing intentional opportunities for growth and development for staff, including our staff of color, and making sure that staff receive the tools and the training needed in order to provide the services to youth and families in the ways that we all envision. And then finally, the sixth component of the framework addresses how youth and families directly experience the system, particularly at the front end of the system, as I mentioned earlier. This includes ensuring that systems use developmentally appropriate and healing-centered and skill-focused and restorative approaches in their work. It means building up staff competencies so that staff understand the impact of trauma and systemic trauma, and working hard to eliminate any re-traumatization that may occur as a result of systemic policies or practices. Ultimately, it's about making sure that youth and families, including youth and families of color, have positive experiences when they do touch the system. So again, this is just the tip of the iceberg. We don't have the time to go deeper into that, but that's what will happen in the BSC. And each team will be taking action in each one of these components in order to identify strategies that make a difference in the lives of kids and families who touch the system or who can be best served in the community. So to hear more about what exactly the BSC methodology entails and how we'll work together with you, let me turn it over to our wonderful partner, Jen Agosti, to talk more about the BSC. Jen?
Thanks, Michael. So a couple notes as I jump into this. This is, you probably already could tell from listening to Michael, this is the crash. This isn't a crash course, but we really do want to have these webinars, these informational opportunities, so that people who are interested, you sort of know what you're getting into before it starts. And Michael just actually gave you the really, really good, 30,000 foot view of what the content, what the scope would be. I'm going to give you the 10-minute version of, we keep saying Breakthrough Series Collaborative, BSC as a methodology. What in the world is it, and how is it different from a training initiative or a conference or another kind of program, project, or initiative that you might have been engaged in related to this work? So next slide. And I should also say that for those of you who will be participating, this really is the 10-minute version. We have a much longer version that will probably make a lot more sense as we go through. But we'll click through this slide, which is the what I call the maxims. So the things that really underscore all Breakthrough Series Collaboratives. There's sort of four sort of little maxims that I like to use. The first is that every system is perfectly designed to achieve exactly the results it gets. And by that, it means that this is a system change initiative, a system transformation initiative. We're not doing tons and tons of training and trying to improve our workforce. What we're doing is going in with the belief that people come to this work wanting to do the very best work that they can, and that it's something in the system that actually prevents that from happening. So it's the system issues that we're going to be tackling at actually a number of levels. The second notion is that we can learn more from collaborating than from working alone. This is why it's not a technical assistance initiative where we deploy, these expert technical assistance providers, one per site, who will intensively work with a single site over the course of a year and a half. What we believe is that we're going to teach you a lot, but you will learn a ton more from the other teams that are participating. So we do a lot of facilitation across sites, across teams to say, what can site A learn from site B, and what can we also say steal shamelessly. I know that's probably not the right term to use, but really what can you take from someone else that would work or need some adaptations that can then be applied. The notion of all improvement requires change, but not all changes lead to improvement, is the fact that all of our work is always anchored in metrics to some degree. And I'll talk a little more about this. This isn't metrics for research or scientific method. This is really around how do we know that the changes that we're making are actually making things better for the young people, families, communities that we serve. So it really is making sure that we're using data to guide our improvement and assess our progress. The last is bridging the gap between what we know and what we do. So we know a lot about this, and Michael just laid out 6 areas where there is a lot we know, and our CSSP partners in particular, have so much rich experience about what can work. The question is, and what we go in again with, is this notion that just because something works doesn't mean it's easy to implement. So a lot of the work in a Breakthrough Series collaborative is rooted in this combination of improvement methodology, so improvement processes, and implementation science. Next slide. So why use a Breakthrough Series for this? What we also believe in this Breakthrough Series is that training is necessary but not sufficient. And we also believe that those who are closest to the work, including our young people and families and community partners, actually are the ones who know best what the system should look like and how it should function. So what we do in a Breakthrough Series collaborative is we focus less on training. We do a fair amount of education and knowledge, but it's really rooted in the education and knowledge for the purpose of moving to action. And by action, we're really not just talking about, again, doing a training and then telling people to go back to work, but it's really about, the action is about changing and testing new practices, changing and testing behaviors. And through that, it ends up shifting the fundamental beliefs and values. And it's the combination of those 3 things that we believe leads to the actual change in outcomes for our young people. And in this collaborative, our young people of color in particular. Next slide. So I like to refer to, people ask me all the time as someone who does a lot of Breakthrough Series collaboratives, like, what's the magic? I talk about this a little bit evangelically. And I happen to think that it's sort of this notion that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So we use this process improvement CQI, and I'll talk a little about that, but this is really our data for improvement, testing ideas in a very small scale first and learning from them, and then applying the learnings to then amplify them and start spreading and scaling up. We use a lot of implementation science. So we talk about not just knowledge and skills in terms of competencies, but we talk about organizational drivers. We talk about leadership drivers. We talk a lot about your context, right? We know that every jurisdiction, there is no cookie cutter approach to making the kinds of changes in the scope of changes around this work that we all want to make. And then we really tap into this notion of what I would call relational dynamics. So what is it that encourages people to embrace a change? There's this notion that people don't like change. I actually believe it's just people don't like being told they should change. And so if we can actually tap into what inspires people to make changes themselves, it actually draws them in and facilitates this much more sustainable, spreadable, scalable kind of transformation that we're going for. Next slide. All right, so Michael listed out the 6 components from a content perspective that every team, and I should say this a number of times, that's not sequential. It's not like everyone starts at component 1 and works their way through sequentially. And it's not like teams get to pick and choose which they do. The expectation is that when you sign on and you get accepted, you're going to agree over the course of the collaborative in some way to actually address all 6. Similarly, we also believe in a Breakthrough Series, and in our Breakthrough Series, there are 5 key elements that all teams will embrace and sort of, embody as part of this work. One is anchored in a single jurisdiction. Everyone will come with a multi-level inclusive team. You'll have a member, at least one, who has lived system experience, a young person who was probably formerly involved in the system in some way. You'll have partners from the youth justice system. You'll have community partners, and by that we mean real community partners. You'll have some of your interconnected system partners, so whether it's child welfare or schools, the medical community, but you'll have partners. And everyone will have this shared voice, this equal power in impacting and driving the change. The next thing is you'll have access to these instructors, content experts who will look and reflect much of that same expertise is on your teams. And the goal, again, is to have that parallel process so that the instructors, the content experts and coaches can actually be providing information and coaching as the teams are actually testing changes. We'll do a lot of facilitation. So again, you'll be sharing across jurisdictions just as much as you'll be learning from the content experts. And there'll be opportunities in person, there'll be conference calls, there'll be a website that we'll all use and share and trade information, ideas, progress. The anchor that, or touchstone, as I like to refer to it, that Michael shared was the collaborative change framework. So those 6 components and the objectives that live within those components will be our touchstones. And every priority, every strategy will be able to link back and say, right now I'm working in component 3, and I'm really focused here in trying to test some changes. And the way teams test changes in a Breakthrough Series collaborative is this thing we call the model for improvement. And I'll talk about that and give an example on the next slide. So the model for improvement is, oh, not the next slide, I lied. It's a few slides forward, but let me talk about this one first. We can go to the next slide, sorry. So here's what teams do, and this is actually just important to note. So what teams do in a Breakthrough Series collaborative is you'll start, and again, this is a little bit sequential, but it's pretty dynamic. Not only will you level the playing field, right? You'll level set so that you have this shared language and shared goals. The main thing that you're going to be doing is as you learn, you're going to be testing your strategies, and then you'll be collecting little tiny bits. I call it micro data. You'll be collecting little bits of studying, of learning that are going to inform what you do next. As you do it, you'll be champions. So you'll be bringing in other people who can embrace the changes, and then you'll also be developing these networks across teams. The goal is that by the end of the collaborative, not only have you already started spreading your successes and actually done some sustainability planning, but you actually are leading the work in your jurisdiction, and then hopefully you're giving some guidance nationally as well, and we're able to share a lot of these lessons learned more broadly, because that's what we believe we want to do in a Breakthrough Series collaborative. Next slide. So here's an example now, and this is the example I was going to give of the model for improvement. So an example of what this might look like. Now this is marrying what Michael talked about from the change framework and the components to what I've just talked about within the Breakthrough Series collaborative is if, for instance, you're focused on that component that's around partnering with youth and families. What you might find is that we would walk you through, and this will be the guidance that you always get, right, is that we'll ask, what are you trying to accomplish? The next question in the model for improvement is, how will you know that a change is an improvement? So you'll start to think about it as your team, and you'll say, okay, well, if we do a good job partnering with youth and families, and we believe it's going to be through this promotion of a hopeful vision of the future, we think that more young people will be involved in the planning, and that young people will report that they're being treated with more respect by the system, right, by the system staff. And then we would coach you to say, okay, so what changes can you test that will result in improvement? Now, here's where it gets really sort of, I would say, fun, which is everyone on the team can have a different idea of what changes to test. And in a Breakthrough Series, everyone can test the changes that are most relevant, most important, highest priority to them. There's no sitting around and spending 6 months deciding which one. Our advocacy is always, whoever wants to test something, go test it, come back and tell us what happened. Now test it with just 1 or 2 or 3 people, but go ahead and test it, try it out. So in this example, right, I might have the idea that I say I want to ask young people directly about their strengths and hopes for the future, right? It sounds simple. I'm going to play it out a little bit more going forward, but that's really the kind of work that a team would do when I was talking about what it would look like to start getting ready to test a change. Next slide. Here's what we know, and here's why we're using a Breakthrough Series. So we've been doing Breakthrough Series collaboratives in human services, so child welfare, child trauma, schools, juvenile justice. healthcare, of course, probably in healthcare, they started in 1995. In child welfare, we started in about 2001. So it's a sort of a tried and true methodology for testing change. But what we know is that when we can bring in the people who are closest to the work and they can drive the change happens at a different kind of pace with a different kind of outcome. We know that by doing it quickly and doing it small scale, it increases the likelihood that it's going to be replicable, scalable, sustainable. It also increases the chances that it's actually realistic. So, you know, all of us have been involved in major system efforts where our plan was that we formed a task force, we spent a year rewriting a policy, and we rolled out the policy and discovered that either nothing changed or people were unable to do what we had intended. And this flips that. It starts to make sure that it's actually realistic and operationalizable before we get to the point of trying to sustain it. And so this whole notion of not relying on over planning means that we just get to work really, really fast. And the last one here in terms of measurement for learning means that along the way, we've got these little signposts, we've got these proxies, we're constantly checking, are things getting better? Are we making changes? Are we making improvements in the ways that we expect? Next slide. Now, what we also know, what we've learned is if you're thinking about putting a team together, here are just some characteristics you want to think about, because we know that all of these things have a pretty good impact on, a pretty big impact on what we would call teams being successful. We know that we need people who are really open to new ways of doing things. We want folks who are not going to be passive learners and listeners, but people who are action focused and ready to hit the ground and start trying new things. There's a passion that goes with this work. And we need people who are passionate not just about youth justice transformation, but who are passionate about racial justice. If you were to sit in our planning teams, that would be really clear, but that's what we're excited to have join us in this work. We also want people, again, who really value lived experience instead of power. And so, you know, we're going to use first names. We're not going to use titles. We're not going to think that some people with degrees have more expertise than those who don't. This is really about all coming together with equal expertise to transform our systems. Next slide. Now, this is the last example that I wanted to play out, because something that I get asked a lot is when people look at that model for improvement, they say, okay, how is that different than the sort of logic model approach that we often use in, you know, our year-long strategic planning processes? And this is what, if I were playing that out and if I were a team, this is what would be different. I would have ended with that last thing, which is what strategies can I test to result in improvement? And it was around asking young people about their hopes and you know, vision for the future. I might make it something so simple that I might come up with 3 questions on strengths and vision that I would ask a few youth over a couple of days. And that would be literally the first cycle. We call that a PDSA, or Plan, Do, Study, Act type cycle. And I would go and test it. And then I'd come back to my team and I'd say, I asked these 3 questions. And what I learned was that young people were not used to being asked these questions and didn't know how to answer. I used too much jargon, and some of the young people told me that I needed to make the questions a little simpler, and that I actually needed to add a question that I was missing. And so I would make those adaptations. I would act and adjust, and then I would roll it, make it a little bit bigger. And my next cycle, I might say, Tiana, will you test this with a couple of your young people? Or Victoria, can you try this out? And so as I'm testing it, I'm starting to learn and adapt and spread it in this really natural way. And I'm starting to say, it's really effective when I ask it right at this point. Or if this particular person asks the questions, that's when it seems to be most effective. And now I'm going to document it in the plan. And I'm going to start forming a process around this new practice. And by the time I get to maybe cycle 6 or cycle 7, cycle 8, there's no magic number. I've now, you know, invited a whole bunch of staff to do it. I've had young people who I've asked the question come and talk to staff and say, it was great when the staff asked me these questions, totally changed the way I think about myself. And I think you should always ask young people this, right? That we've got champions now in all these different places. And now the person we call our senior leader on the team, who's part of our team and has authority and responsibility over our system, is now working with the team to say, all right, guys, what guidance do we need to develop? Is there training that needs to surround this? Any changes needed to our data system to capture this? You know, how do we make sure that this gets formalized and that the staff that start next week, this is the way they learn how to work with our young people. So that's how we go in a breakthrough series from these really small tests of change within those components to all of a sudden over time rolling into sustainable change that ideally transforms the system. So that's, again, a little brief snippet of what it could look like. Next slide. And that is it for me. I think there were a couple hands, but let me turn it back over to the team at Georgetown to talk a little about the selection process.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tiana Davis. I'm the Policy Director for Equity and Justice with the Center for Children's Law and Policy. Thank you, Jen, for walking us through that crash course in BSC methodology. And I'm going to take a little bit of time right now to talk about the selection process and the criteria. If we could advance to the next slide. So hopefully by this point, you're asking yourselves whether or not you should apply. And I think, just kind of hearing Jen talk through the characteristics of successful BSC teams, hopefully you will find that the values and goals represented by those characteristics are aligned with your work and what you hope to do in terms of advancing racial justice and transforming the youth justice system in your community. Are you committed to racial justice? Hopefully the answer there is yes. Are you committed to transforming the ways in which the youth justice system props up structural racism that we know exists in our country? If the answer is yes, then certainly we hope you would consider applying. Again, as Jen outlined, the BSC prioritizes action. The BSC prioritizes inclusion. We really need to bring all resources to bear to contribute to the co-creation of racial equity through practice at all levels of our justice system, as well as across all of our child serving systems and community supports. And so there's really an opportunity here to think more broadly about the way that our youth justice system functions within the broader context of our society. And it really, really calls for a true transformation so that we can shift these disparate outcomes that we see for young people of color and their families, and to, as a result, shift all of the ways in which we know that involvement with the youth justice system limits young people of color's life opportunities. Once you've gotten to that yes, the question is, how do we build a team? What do we do to develop an application? And that's what I'm gonna walk through right now, if we could advance to the next slide. So the first question many of you are probably asking is related to the cost. I should share that due to the generous investment of the McCourt family, and we are able to offer this opportunity for an investment of $20,000 per team who would participate. And again, it would, without that support, the cost would be much greater. And we really hope that the fact that this is an innovative and unprecedented opportunity for racial equity impact in your community, and to share that impact and share that learning and share strategies across communities will be something that encourages folks to want to participate in this Breakthrough Series collaborative. Again, we have instructors and facilitators that are coming from all different walks of life and different places across our country, as well as different backgrounds, to bring a really robust set of supports to each of the teams as you all engage in the work of transforming your systems. And then, of course, you will have the opportunity to learn and share from folks in other sites who also bring expert instruction and facilitation in their learning to this cross-site collaborative. And so we're really looking forward to receiving many applications and really seeing some excitement around this new opportunity, because it's certainly something that we are very excited about. And of course, funding is always an issue. If there are ways that we can support you all in thinking through where you might access funding to support participation in this initiative, we are certainly open to those conversations. Next slide, please. So the next step will be to think about building your Breakthrough Series Collaborative Transformation Partnership. And in this graphic here, you see you have a couple of different circles that represent different elements of your team. So we wanted to start with the core team, which is comprised of 9 members. And so you'll see here, you have a core team circle in lavender purple, and then within that circle you have a day-to-day manager and 2 co-senior leaders. So the 2 co-senior leaders will lead the team. Your day-to-day manager will sort of manage the day-to-day operations and make sure that the work gets done and that the work moves forward. And then there's a core team of 6 additional stakeholders who will participate in that in the core team with a total of 9, and then an extended team, which is going to include and create an opportunity for your core team to leverage a number of different stakeholders within your community as needed. And wanted to just, if we could go to the next slide, talk a little bit about your day-to-day manager. As I mentioned previously, the day-to-day manager oversees and supports the activities of both the core team and the extended team. The day-to-day manager will plan and adjust and document your rapid tests of change that Jen mentioned earlier, your plan, study, do, act, and making sure that we're keeping track of what's happening there and identifying what the outcomes are so that we can know what the next step would be, whether it's something that we want to try to grow or if it's something that's not meeting the outcomes that we had hoped. And the day-to-day manager, of course, will probably be investing more time than some of the other members. We anticipate that the day-to-day manager will spend about 5 to 10% of their work time serving in the role as the day-to-day manager, and that's inclusive of their participation as a core team member. Next slide, please. So the other 2 special members of the core team include the 2 co-senior leaders. And here, as we had mentioned previously, the goal is to really create balance and a sharing of power and in driving the process and in decision making around the transformation work. And so the co-senior leaders will lead the collaborative process and seek out and leverage opportunities to broaden the reach and scope and sustainability of the work of the BSC. And our first co-senior leader, we believe, should be a youth family member or a community member as a senior leader, and then they will have a counterpart who is representing a system agency or organization that has an operational authority within the youth justice system. And these 2 together will, again, work to lead the work of the core team and extended team through the BSC, and will probably, we estimate, spend about 2 to 5% of their work time during the implementation phase of the BSC. And on the next slide, please. So again, the day-to-day manager and the 2 co-senior leaders are members of the core team. The core team is the 9 core folks who you could think of as your travel team, who will represent the diversity of the system and community stakeholders in your jurisdiction. The core team will be responsible for implementation. There's a requirement that the core team members attend the certificate program and learning sessions that are related to the BSC, that are part of the BSC core learning opportunities of the BSC, that will then sort of inform the work that you do back in your jurisdictions. And the core team members we expect will spend about 2 to 5% of their work time focusing on the BSC, in addition to time that they will spend attending the certificate program and the learning session. So it's really a significant investment of time from the core team members in the work of transformation. Next slide, please. And so now we wanted to say just a little bit more about the composition of your core team. There's a lot of thought put into this structure, and again, is informed by our many conversations with folks who are engaged in this work across the country. And you see here, we have identified a couple of key roles. We know that communities are often very unique in their administrative structures and their leadership roles and programs and services. So we've outlined the team composition requirements in terms of role, the definition of the role, and then a few examples of personnel that might fit into that role. And again, as you see, there are 4 key sort of categories of roles. We want to make sure that we're engaging folks with lived system experience, folks who are leadership within the youth justice system, and staff members within the youth justice system, and then of course community partners, which is very critical to this conversation, and then our interconnected system partners, whether it's the education system or behavioral health system, where we've identified that there are some drivers within those systems that are driving young people of color to the youth justice system. We want to make sure that those folks are represented and those agencies and systems are represented, as they often can create access to solutions that would lead to better outcomes for young people and families of color. And so if we start with lived system experience, again, we have young people and families of young people with prior youth justice experience or involvement. We have 2 slots in the lived system experience for on the core team. And the recommendation is that there would be 1 young person with that prior justice experience and a family member with that prior justice experience. For the youth justice system, stakeholders, of course, we have leadership there, folks who have that authority to make policy and practice decisions, line staff in the youth justice system, whether it's intake or someone who's making decisions about diversion or other key decisions along the youth justice system pathway, and again, a representative from local law enforcement, because we know that that arrest is often the gateway for many or most young people who find themselves in contact with the justice system. So you have 4 opportunities there to bring in voices from within the system. Again, we have community partners. Community partners would be representatives of community organizations that are anchored in and that reflect communities of color most deeply impacted by the youth justice system, and or that provide direct services to those young people. And there's the opportunity to include a community development organization whose goal and mission is related to uplifting a community in ways that are sort of go beyond service delivery. And so we want to make sure that these teams are robust. There's diverse inclusion in the stakeholder team so that we can have diversity of possible solutions and leverage authority and power from communities, from system folks, and from people who have actually had these experiences with the youth justice system. And again, this is, we know that folks are from different communities and that those teams might look different. So if there are questions about who you need to bring to the table, again, we are here to answer those questions. We'll move to the next slide. Finally, this is the extended team, which is the biggest circle on that initial graphic that you saw. Our extended team is really just an opportunity to pull in additional stakeholders from your community that can support the work of transformation, and that amplifies and expands the work and the reach of the core team. The extended team would be expected to participate in all of your collaborative activities, except for the certificate program and the learning sessions. And again, extended team members will be expected to contribute 2 to 5% of their work time, or if not, so coming to the table in an official work-related capacity, 2 to 5% of a standard work week would be the expectation and anticipation of time commitment. Next slide, please. And quickly here, don't need to read through all of this, are possible directions you might need to go, or as you build out your extended team. The extended team is something that you would build out as you move through the BSC process and engage in the work. So it's developed on an as needed basis. So this is not something that you would need to identify necessarily as you prepare your application. But again, you might want to look at this as an opportunity to include additional voices among youth and families who have had experience with the system, prosecutors, public defenders, juvenile court judges, other community stakeholders. So there's really sort of limitless possibilities that you might want to engage on your extended team, depending on the work that you have identified for yourselves. Next slide, please. Finally, once you've got all that together, got all your folks convened, we recommend that each jurisdiction pull together the team of senior leaders and potential core team members to review the information that we have provided in the application document, and to discuss the current capacity within the jurisdiction to support this effort. Once you have determined that that you are prepared, you have the capacity and the will to engage in this work, we encourage that the core team members work together to gather all the information that you need for the application, and which is due to the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform by midnight on August 20th in the applicant's local time zone. And just for clarity, we recommend that folks plan to submit by 11:59 p.m. on August 19th, so that there is no confusion. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Amber Farn from CJJR, who's going to talk a little bit about the timelines for application.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. This is Amber. Since we have quite a lot of activities before and after the application process, I just want to spend a couple of minutes summarizing the timeline of events. First, we are holding office hour, as Michael mentioned at the very beginning of the webinar. Next slide. So the office hour is for interested communities to join Zoom, and during this time, you can meet with our staff and ask any questions that you might have for the application process. The next office hour we have is on August 3rd between 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern time zone, and you will find our Zoom link on our BSC website. If your jurisdiction is interested in applying for the BSC, you might benefit from submitting a brief interested applicants form. That's due next Monday/Tuesday, July 20th, so Monday right before midnight. You are not required to submit this form to apply, but you will get reminders and follow-up emails about the application timeline. And then the application itself is due on August 20th, like Tiana mentioned, or August 19th at 11:59 p.m. your local time zone. We will review the application and notify you regarding the first round of acceptance by early September. And then we'll also share the team interview time specifically with you at that, around that time. And the interviews are held on September 15th and 16th. So you'll hear from us in mid-October about the selection status. Next slide. After you're accepted into the program, there are also quite a few events to note on your calendar. First, we have a 2-hour orientation webinar on October 26th at 3 p.m. Eastern. And on the same day, your core team must register by 5 p.m. Eastern time as well. And then for the main certificate program, it's held on the week of April 25th in Washington, D.C. And we will also have a series of pre-work designated between October and April. Last but not least, we have 3 one-day in-person learning sessions, but this will be coordinated and scheduled with you after the teams are selected. With that, I will turn to Victoria for any questions.
Thanks so much, Amber. And I know we have just a couple minutes here. I'm actually going to see if I can unmute Crystal Wynn Lewis. You've had your hand up for some time now, and I'm going to see if I can unmute you here. I think that I'll also, so after I unmute you, I think you'll also have to unmute on your side. So give me just a moment here so we can get your question. So Crystal, I've unmuted you. If you're able to unmute and speak up and ask your question, please feel free to do so. And so Crystal, while you're doing that, it looks like we also have a question that came in through the Q&A, and it says, is this an opportunity that states should consider, or is it designed solely for local jurisdictions? And so I'm actually going to turn this over. Michael, would you like to respond to this question?
Hi, Victoria. Yeah, sure, I'd be happy to. I think that we envisioned this opportunity primarily for local jurisdictions, just given the realities of implementing some of the strategies in real time that Jen was describing. However, I do think that if a state level team would apply jointly with a locality, that we would certainly entertain that application. I think our goal is to make sure that we have teams that are able to take action in real time to test out these policies and practices and approaches in order to inform our body of work with the BSC. So again, I think that we were primarily thinking that local jurisdictions would apply, but we would welcome applications from the state level as well, particularly joint applications for this opportunity.
Great, thank you so much, Michael. And I'm going to try once more to unmute Crystal. Are you able to speak up, and would you like to share your question? Okay. So I don't see any additional questions in the Q&A. If you have any questions for our team, again, please reach out to myself, Victoria Chamberlain at vac54@georgetown.edu, or Macon Stewart, macon.stewart@georgetown.edu. With any questions that you have, we've put the website for the BSC in the chat. You can find all sorts of information about the application materials, any contact information, our upcoming office hour on August 3rd, and all associated materials on that website. So please visit that, and we will share a live recording or a recording of this live event with you all following the webinar. Michael and team, are there any last comments that you would like to make before we close out today?
Yes, this is Tiana.
It's
Victoria.
4 o'clock.
I just wanted to share, just make sure that we shared that upon receiving the applications, there will be an internal review, and each of the teams that are selected as finalists will be invited to participate in a team interview. So we just wanted to recommend that for any team that decides to apply, all of the core team members should set aside the dates of September 15th and 16th on their calendar, or set aside some time on those days so that we can, so that you'll have some flexibility in scheduling those interviews.
Thanks, Tiana. And this is Michael. I do recognize that we're at our time, but I'm seeing a question coming in, Victoria, about whether jurisdictions who participated in our Reducing Racial and Ethnic Disparity Certificate program, which we've co-hosted with CCLP, should they be encouraged to pursue this opportunity as well? And I think our answer to that one would be absolutely. This is a different methodology, a different approach. I think that you've heard, what those unique differences are. And again, we really are looking for jurisdictions who are committed to advancing race equity and reducing those disparities that are faced by young people and families. And so absolutely should be encouraged to apply, even if you've been with us or in other similar efforts focused on race equity issues. The other thing that I just wanted to add in terms of eligibility for applying is that we are accepting applications from tribal jurisdictions as well. So to the extent that we have anyone on the line from the tribes who's interested in being part of this, absolutely are encouraged to apply as well.
All right, thank you very much, Michael, and thank you everyone for your participation today.